To our Stand Together Week 2020 kickoff event. This Stand Together Week will look very different from years past, but still it's such an important week in the Portland Timbers and Portland Thorns organization. And we are honored to have such an esteemed guest for the kickoff event this year, Dr. Richard Lapchick, who is going to speak and talk to everybody about his life and his work. Just to give a quick rundown before we get going of kind of what's going to happen, Dr. Lapchick is going to give his talk, and then we're going to have a kind of a question and answer discussion segment to this. Timbers forward Jeremy Ebobisse is going to join us for a discussion with Dr. Lapchick, and then it'll be open to questions and answers from those of you watching. If you have a question for Dr. Lapchick, you can submit it via YouTube comments just to the left, or to the right rather, as you're looking at the screen. On YouTube, and then we'll give those questions to Dr. Lapchick towards the end of this event. But first, to introduce Dr. Lapchick and to get it going, it's the president of business of the Portland Timbers, Mike Golub.
Thank you, Jake, and welcome everybody. We are so honored and grateful to have Dr. Richard Lapchick as our keynote speaker to kick off our 9th annual Stand Together Week. Dr. Lapchick's one of the leading minds and one of the leading voices in our country on human rights, social justice, and racial equality. And for those of us in the sports industry, he is a generational leader and truly a beacon for all of us on how to use sports as an instrument for positive social change. I feel privileged to know Dr. Lapchick, and his work continues to influence and inform my career. And if I were to list all of Dr. Lapchick's accomplishments, we probably would miss our game on Sunday versus the Sounders. But let me try to give you just a few highlights. He's working on his 17th book and is a regular columnist for ESPN.com. He has 9 honorary degrees. Dr. Lapchick has spoken in Congress, the European Parliament, and at the United Nations. He has more awards than Diego Valeri, Lionel Messi, and Ronaldo combined. So I encourage you to read his bio, but leave yourself a lot of time. But a couple of the awards I wanted to highlight: Lifetime Achievement Award for work in civil rights by Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition. Dr. Lapchick received the Arthur Ashe Voice of Conscience Award, the Women's Sports Foundation President's Award, just to name a few. In 1985, Dr. Lapchick helped form the Institute for Sport and Social Justice that now includes more than 280 colleges. And to date, over 34,000 student athletes have participated in the Institute's programs, and in turn have worked with more than 19 million young people in schools and community outreach programs. Dr. Lapchick's day job is the chair of the DeVos Sports Business Management Program at the University of Central Florida, which is one of the best programs in the country of its kind, producing young leaders in the sports industry, including the Timbers' very own Blair Nealons, who's part of our Stand Together team. In 2002, under Dr. Lapchick's leadership, the DeVos program launched the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, which, among other things, produces the annual Racial and Gender Scorecard, which is the gold standard in the sports industry. We are so grateful that Dr. Lapchick's made time to spend the afternoon with us. Please join me in welcoming him. And before we do, we'd like to show you a video about Dr. Lapchick and his work and his life that ESPN produced. So let's throw it to the video, please.
Richard grew up in a family where there was a strong tradition of doing the right thing. His father was an iconic figure. He signed Sweetwater Clifton to the Knicks, breaking the color barrier.
His recollections alone of being around his father growing up would fill a dinner table conversation with great tales, meeting Jackie Robinson when he was a kid, seeing what his father went through for fielding the first black player in Knick history.
Joe was someone who, as a coach, never let race get in the way of doing the right thing. And there's no question that had a huge impact on Richard himself.
When I was 14, I was at a basketball camp with 5 other white guys. One of the white guys was hurling the N-word at the black guy day in and day out till I challenged him, and this guy had knocked me out cold. Well, the black guy was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, and a lifelong friendship grew out of that.
Everything Richard has fought for has not been popular at the time. And he has been this courageous light that has said, this needs to be said, this needs to be heard, and I'm going to say it.
There's a fine line sometimes between being courageous and putting your life on the line. With progress comes pain. And that was a price that he was willing to pay.
When I was the American leader of the sports boycott of South Africa, I was actually attacked in my office in a college library by two masked men and had the N-word carved in my stomach.
Richard had very bravely spoken out against apartheid. There were risks involved. There were just a lot of bigots who didn't like what he had to say.
He was attacked for standing up and wanting to right a wrong. And to be brutally attacked as he was, to have the N-word carved with scissors into his stomach, he had to have been frightened beyond words. And a lesser person would have said, okay, that's it, I'm done. Not Rich. They who did that, it's the wrong person.
I've been involved in civil rights for the last 28 years of my life, but I can never, ever, ever know what it's like to be black. That's an instantaneous, every minute sentence that society has given to black communities and Hispanic communities in this country, that discrimination can take place at any time.
My dad taught me that a leader is somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. I've spent most of my adult life trying to help young people who live in crises that have become more profound as the generations have gone on.
You know, he's really been in the forefront in the whole bridge between sports and using that to achieve equality, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
He's been involved in civil rights and race issues for his entire life.
I automatically smile when I think of Richard. Wow. I smile and also a tear comes to my eye. Whew. He's a good man. I thank him. I'm appreciative of the work that he has done. Thank you. Thank you, Richard Lapchick. Thank you for being you, and thank you for wanting this world to be a better place, and because of you, it is.
So this is a world in 2020. Dr. Lapchick, if you could unmute your microphone. We couldn't hear what you were saying. Again, we're pandemic time. We're all used to this, aren't we? This should work now. Perfect. Didn't mean to interrupt, but we obviously all wanted to hear you. Well, take it away, Dr. Lapchick.
Okay. My apologies for my technological guffaw there. I started by saying how grateful I was to Mike for his warm and very personal introduction. I mentioned that Blair Nealons, who he mentioned as a graduate of our program, is one of the finest people I've met in my 50 years of higher education. What circumstances we're meeting here today under, with both the pandemic and the racial reckoning going on simultaneously, a unique time in American history, to say the least. You must be wondering, or some of you, why is the 75-year-old white guy here talking to us today about the racial reckoning and other social justice issues? And my Twitter bio might give us some clue. It says husband, dad, activist, anti-racist, feminist, abolitionist, animal lover, vegan, UCF Knight, and educator. What I'm going to try to do tonight is talk about how we are facing uncomfortable truths in America that really need to be faced. Obviously, the George Floyd murder and murders that followed that have led to what's being called the racial reckoning, as we all learn that racism in various parts of our society can be directly linked back to the days of slavery. Several years ago, the Me Too movement had us confront sexism and misogyny, which we're still confronting today. The recent news about the Washington football team opened up discussions again, how the very founding of our country was built on genocide of a large number of people. I live in Orlando, where the Pulse nightclub shooting 4 years ago showed us how homophobic we still are in too many parts of America. We're a violent country. We read about young people being killed in Chicago, 12 sometimes over the course of a weekend, and we seem to be shocked. But on any given day in America, 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun wound. It's not about Chicago. It's about what we have going on around the country. So we're all from the world of sport, and it's a new world of sport that we're living in today. The pandemic has obviously shut down sports for a long period of time, but I was really proud of the way sports stepped up in a leadership role during the pandemic. It really was when Adam Silver pulled the plug on the NBA after one of his players tested positive that we began to shut down the country, as we were kind of bumbling along until that point. The very next day, a rookie, Zion Williamson, donated $1 million to help the people who worked at the arena where the team was going to play that year, who would no longer have an income. And in the next several months, athletes, coaches, managers, presidents, and owners in the world of sport put up over $100 million at a time they were being economically set back to help the people who were being put out of work in their arenas, but also to go into the coronavirus relief efforts. We felt the vacuum without sport, a vacuum that's now starting to be opened up by the resumption of games in Major League Soccer and the NBA and Major League Baseball, and the WNBA. We're so happy to have them back, but in the middle of the start of all that happening, we had the murder of 3 individuals in a short period of time. It made us look back and understand that in 2019, there were only 27 days in that entire year when a policeman did not murder somebody. We began to look at the disproportionate number of people of color who were the victims of those murders, and it began to raise the questions about racism. But what we needed to do was to get beyond just police brutality and community relations and understand what systemic racism was doing and what other forms of discrimination do and did to women, to all people of color, to people in the LGBT community, to anybody who comes from a community where discrimination can take place. But before I get into those details, I want to spend a little bit more time telling you about the life that I've led and the influences that have brought me to your video here this evening. So you saw in the video introduction that as a 5-year-old boy, my dad integrated the NBA. I had no idea what it meant. I didn't know why when I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, and saw his image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. I didn't know what it was when I would pick up the extension phone, my dad not knowing I was listening. And it was racial epithet after racial epithet. I would be probably 9 or 10 years old before I began to understand that as the coach of the Knicks, he had signed the first African-American player, and now in the league, there's nearly 80% players of color. In 1950, there were a lot of people in America who were not ready for that to happen. I was raised by this guy who was a double inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame. He was the first grade big man in the game. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade, one of the tallest players in New York City, and was living the dream that I would follow in his footsteps. It wasn't that anybody saw any talent. It was just that I was his son, and people assumed that that talent would someday emerge. I was heavily recruited by a school called Power Memorial High School, which was the top basketball program in the country. I chose not to go there, but became friends with the coach, and it was his camp that you saw in the video where I met Kareem Abdul-Jabbar after taking a punch to try to stop one of the other campers, and a player on that high school team, from dropping the N-word on him day in and day out for the first 3 days. That friendship has become so rich that I was the speaker when his statue was unveiled at the Staples Center. I was one of his 2 guests with Henry Louis Gates at the White House when he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom in Barack Obama's last month in office. And when I was scheduled to have surgery in Orlando, Kareem flew from Los Angeles to be in Orlando with me. But the important thing at that time, as a young boy, 15 years old, coming from an almost all white community, was that I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens to be able to see what racism was doing in communities of color in the United States. I decided as a 15-year-old that I was going to spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. I had no idea what that would mean at that particular point, but I was going to pursue that goal. I went and got a PhD in international race relations and did my doctoral dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response, and compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 30s. It eventually got published as a book. I started speaking about apartheid and founded the sports boycott of South Africa in the United States. We didn't really compete with South Africa at that time. They were playing mostly European countries, New Zealand, Britain, and Australia, but those countries started to boycott South Africa, and I knew that they were going to come to the United States. And finally, a Davis Cup team came in 1978. And as you saw in the video, I was working late in my college office. I had just spent the weekend in Nashville building up the protests, and I had been working with the African governments who had asked me to announce that they would boycott the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1984 if this team was allowed to come. So all 3 networks were there. Dick Schaap, who's Jeremy's dad and a famous broadcaster in that era, came up to me after the press conference and said the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd, which was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I went home to Virginia, where I was teaching that night, I felt that maybe for the first time I had done something worthwhile in my lifetime. The next night was the night I was working late in my college office. The office was in the school's library. The library closed at 10:30. At 10:45, there was a knock on the door, and I assumed it was the campus security. But when I opened the door, instead, it was 2 men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, a concussion, and carved the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. I realized lying in the hospital that night that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my father 28 years before, and to the length they did that night to try to stop me, that they must have felt that us using the sports platform to address racism was having an effect on racism. And I decided that I would use that sports platform for the rest of my life to address various issues of social justice, and particularly the one about race. I became a personal and profound period of time in my life, obviously, but there were other factors that had a great influence in my life as well. There were women in my life. My sister, so I'm 75, my sister's 87. She was a civil rights activist in the 1950s before it was even called the Civil Rights Movement. She moved to Africa in 1961, and I began to read about Africa and fall in love with the continent. My wife, Ann, who's been the love of my life for 34 years, will, anytime she hears something sexist on television or in public, she'll point it out if I've missed it, to make sure that I don't overlook what was being said or what was being carried out. And our own daughter, Emily, who's 31, has been a civil rights activist herself, mainly working on the area of human trafficking. So I learned a lot about sexism through these 3 women and through things I did in school. We learned a lot and heard a lot about the gender pay gap in the last election. We heard often that white women earn 78 cents on the dollar compared to a white man in the same job. What they weren't talking about was African-American women were earning 64 cents on the dollar and Latinas were earning 53 cents on the dollar. Women make up 51% of the American population, but they only hold 19% of the seats in the House of Representatives and 23% of the seats in the US Senate. We rank, if you can believe this, 100th globally in terms of the percentage of women holding national government positions, after Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. Maybe it's why we're one of only 4 countries in the world, along with Lesotho, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea, that do not mandate paid maternity leave in the United States. Only 4% of Fortune 500 companies are led by women. Yet when you look at the global situation for women, our situation in the United States begins to look significantly better. I had read a book called Half the Sky by Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl Wudunn that was very influential in my life. It was a book about the oppression of women globally and the heroic response of individual women in those countries to fight for their human rights. The statistics that stuck in my mind and make me shudder almost every day when I think about them are these: that there were more women and girls who died in the 20th century simply because they were a woman or a girl than all the soldiers who died in all of the conflicts of the 20th century combined. That there were more women and girls who were murdered simply because they were a woman or a girl in an act of gendercide than all of the people who died in acts of genocide in the 20th century. Every day I wake up and think about the 32 million school-age girls around the world who won't be going to school that day because it's either against the law or against the culture of that nation for a girl to get an education. It's why this wonder child, now growing into a woman, Malala, won the Nobel Peace Prize, because at age 16, she literally risked her life to fight for the opportunity for girls in her village to get an education. Girls and women between the ages of 15 and 44 globally are more likely to die or be maimed by male violence than because of cancer, malaria, war, and traffic accidents combined. 100,000 girls under the age of 12 are sold as child brides overseas, never to see their families again. There are more than 100 million women and girls globally who have experienced female genital mutilation, which is a surgical procedure done on female genitalia for non-surgical reasons because of a cultural norm. Former President Jimmy Carter called the oppression of women and girls perhaps the greatest oppression globally. I'm not sure if it's the greatest, but it's certainly up there with the others. And one of the statistics that I'll talk about a little more later is that literally millions of girls and women are sold into the sex trade and human trafficking around the world. But there are many other social justice issues that I want to touch on, at least briefly today. When Barack Obama became president, there were 600 hate groups in the United States. When he left office, there were 925 hate groups. Today, it's estimated that there are 1,100 hate groups. There's been a 1,000% increase in white supremacist groups since Barack Obama took office. Our children are learning how to hate each other. They're also waging war on one another. I told you about 12 children a day under the age of 16 dying of a handgun wound. 400,000 high school students, according to the Center for Disease Control, were hospitalized because of a violent incident that took place on their high school property during high school hours, not late at night in some unseemly part of town, but during high school hours on high school property. 400,000 children were taken to the emergency room. Urban dropout rates are 40%. American women are battered at the rate of 4.5 million a year. 900,000 are raped every year. Teenage pregnancy is a huge factor in America. 34% of teenage girls have a child before they reach the age of 20. And when surveyors ask them, why did you risk completing your education? 1% will go to college, 3% will actually finish high school. Those young girls have a simple answer: I wanted somebody to love me. They didn't feel loved at that point in their lives. We're the biggest consumers of drugs in the world. The biggest consumers of drugs in the United States are people under the age of 25. Why do you take a drug? Presumably you think you feel better with it than without it. The biggest consumers of performance-enhancing drugs in the United States are not NFL players or Major League Baseball players or track and field athletes. They're teenage boys under the age of 16 who aren't athletes at all, who want to be stronger or faster or whatever it is they're trying to change about their bodies, using this substance that they generally know is going to harm them for the rest of their lives. The Penn State football story several years ago shed a spotlight on the issue of child abuse. But we need to know that it wasn't just about those 11 victims of Jerry Sandusky, the assistant coach at Penn State, that there's a report of child abuse made in the United States every 10 seconds, and 1 in 10 is reported. You can do the math and figure out how extensive this is. Human trafficking, it's estimated that during the 240 years of the slave trade in the United States, that there were 24 million people who were enslaved. 10 million in the United States, 8 million in Africa, another 6 million in Asia, over 240 years. It's estimated today that there's somewhere between 28 and 42 million people around the globe who are enslaved. More than half are women and girls, and most of those girls are brought into the sex trade at age 12. It's a huge, huge civil rights issue in this country and around the world. But I think the greatest disparity for me, and everything else comes from it, is the wealth gap. The wealth gap in the United States is the difference between the aggregate savings of whatever group you're going to compare them to. So the statistic that is to me most stunning is that the Forbes list of the 100 wealthiest people in America have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million Black Americans combined. 100 people have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. This affects housing, this affects education, this affects healthcare, it affects and creates that systemic racism that we're talking about in our country today. Life expectancy, if you're in the top 10% of income earners, you're going to live 14 years longer than if you're in the bottom 10%. Black infant mortality rate in this country is twice that of white babies. We've all read during the COVID crisis about the disparate impact of the virus on communities of color. 2 to 3 times the amount are infected, 3 times the amount die of the virus than in the white community, as bad as it is in the white community. We have 5% of the world's prison population, but we have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prison population. They're mostly brown and Black. They've mostly committed crimes that won't even be on the books of state legislatures in the years ahead, minor drug offenses. And some people will cynically say, well, when they get out of jail, they'll be okay, they can resume a normal life. It's not quite that simple. They're not entitled to public assistance. They can't live in public housing. They can't vote. And if they go to interview for a job and the employer says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And the answer is yes, that's usually going to be the end of the interview. So I'm going to have about 30 minutes with you in terms of speaking this morning or this evening. And if it's a typical 30 minutes in the United States, I want to share with you what would have happened. 70 children dropped out of high school. 23 high school students were victimized by violence. 42 children were reported missing. 1,800 children were abused. 258 women or girls were battered. 52 were raped. 57 were enslaved during these 30 minutes that I'm going to be speaking to you this evening. I don't have any doubt that if there were more women and people of color who were in charge, that these numbers would be changed dramatically. We'd be addressing these critical issues that we're talking about this afternoon, as opposed to what's generally on the national agenda. If you listen to people with diverse backgrounds, you're going to make better decisions. You're going to have more breadth of what to choose from. You're going to help children believe in what they can't see. You're going to help build a floor on the despair that too many children live in and a roof over their dreams. How do I feel about America today? I know I've just painted a pessimistic picture, but I have to tell you that I'm not pessimistic. I think we've talked about facing these uncomfortable truths, and the question is, can everyone really be equal? I believe that we can. In 1977, I was in Lusaka in Zambia with my mentor, George Hauser. George Hauser, if he was alive today, would be 104. He lived to be 100. He did the first Freedom Ride in 1944. He founded the Congress of Racial Equality. He went to prison for 2 years as a conscientious objector, and he founded the anti-apartheid movement and the anti-colonial movements in the United States. And he was a white guy. So he had a big influence on me, thinking that I, as a white man, might have a role to play in this civil rights movement in the United States. So in 1977, I asked him, George, do you think that we're ever going to live to see South Africa, as it was then called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Namibia free? And George Hauser looked at me in the eye and he said, Rich, I feel it in my gut. Nelson Mandela was 12 years away from being freed from prison. Nobody thought he would be freed from prison. Apartheid was at its height, and it was impacting Namibia and Rhodesia. There was no reason for George Hauser to think that he would live to see those things happen. But in May of 1994, George Hauser and I stood on the steps of the Union buildings in Pretoria as Nelson Mandela's guests, as he became the president of what had been the most racist system of government on the face of the earth in the second half of the 20th century. A political prisoner for 27 years became the president of the most racist system of government on the face of the earth. If that could happen, it can happen in the United States. I feel it in my gut. I think the Generation Z and the millennials are more progressive than previous generations and more committed to social justice. They have the technology that Mike and I didn't have. Mike and I looked at newspapers and saw pictures of Emmett Till in the coffin and were horrified by that, or pictures of Montgomery church bombing. But we saw a black man lose his life in front of us several months ago, and that started what has become this racial reckoning. I feel it in my gut because I think white people are listening more than they did before. I think that they are trying to understand that a white person really can't get what it's like to be black. So let's listen and find out what racism does on a daily basis in their lives. And I think one of the things that gives me the most hope is in our own world of sport. It's athlete activism. 4 years ago when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, I think most sports fans in the country were probably opposed to his doing that. This 2 weeks ago, the Nielsen study on sports fans and race showed that sports fans in America, across all races and across genders, are supportive of athlete activism. They think brands should support athlete activism. They think that they personally are becoming active in the Black Lives Matter movement. The sports fans are at a rate of 77%. More than half have made donations to those organizations that are fighting against racism. This, to me, is incredible positive news. I think that I want to close with suggesting some things that we all can do. We can listen more. So when I was attacked in 1978, a lot of people came up to me and said, "You must not understand now what it's like to be black." And my response to them then and my response to them today is that I don't understand what it's like to be black. I could walk away from this civil rights movement at any time and be back in a white middle class comfortable life and never face discrimination again. If I was black, tomorrow I would be black and face discrimination every single day. Hopefully it would never happen, but I would know that it's possible that it could happen on any given day. Take responsibility for educating yourself. Read more about racism and the effects of discrimination that I've raised in kind of outline form here. Raise your voices. Demonstrate if you're able to. Volunteer for an organization that's fighting for some cause that you believe in. Donate if you can afford it, both your time as well as resources if you have. And perhaps most importantly, when you get the chance in November to vote, not only in this presidential election, but in local elections where you can vote for sheriffs and police chiefs and school leaders. Get the people in there that you want. So a lot of people ask me why I stay in the world of sport. And as I said earlier, it's because I understand the power of sport to make people listen and get positive attention to social justice issues. But more than that, it's what I call the miracle of sport. And a former football coach named Bill Curry shared the concept with us when he worked with us. He said that once we get inside that huddle in our world of sport, which I think is our most diverse workplace in America and around the world, it suddenly doesn't matter if you're African American or white or Latino or Asian American or Arab American. It doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Sikh, Jew, Hindu, or Muslim, young or old, gay or straight, come from a rich family or a poor family. If you don't pull together, that team's not going to win. Imagine if we brought that into our corporate offices, into our institutions of higher education, into faith-based America, what a different world we would be living in that we can learn from in the world of sport. I want to leave you this afternoon with a story about Eddie Robinson. Eddie Robinson, if you don't know, was the football coach at Grambling State University for 57 years. He had more wins than any other coach in the history of college football, sent more players to the NFL than any other coach in the history of college football, had a graduation rate of 80% in the sport, where at the time it hovered around 50%, never had an athlete get in trouble with the law. I was blessed to be asked to write his autobiography with him and became friends. And it was a rich relationship that we developed. And when he passed in 2007, I was asked by his wife, Doris, to be one of the people who delivered the eulogy. So there we are in Grambling State's brand new convocation center, 10,000 people in the building, another couple of thousand people outside. And before me spoke Willie Davis, who was one of his great former players, played in the NFL for many years, All-Pro, Hall of Famer, now one of the wealthiest African-American entrepreneurs in the country. And Willie Davis got up in front of that crowd and he said, "I'd like all of Coach Robinson's former players to stand up." This is still me talking. The first time I went to Grambling State, Coach Robinson said, "Rich, you really have to want to come here to go here. You have to really want to be come here to get here." And I didn't understand what he meant until I realized how far in deep rural Louisiana Grambling State was. So now Willie Davis says, "I'd like all of Coach Robinson's former players to stand up." 2,400 men stood up. Players from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s came there to thank him one more time for whatever it was they felt that Coach Robinson had done for their lives. made me think every day for the rest of my life since 2007. What am I going to have done? Who's going to come when it's my turn? And to be able to ask audiences like yourselves, when it's your turn, who's going to come? What will you have done that they're going to want to come there and thank you for? I want to close with a power of sports story featuring Nelson Mandela. So as I said, I was at his inauguration. After it was over, all of the embassies in Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, were having parties for him. President Mandela didn't go to any of them. He instead went to a Zambia, South Africa, are you ready, soccer match, where he asked me to sit in the box with him. And obviously I accepted the invitation, and I said, Mr. President, why did you come here when all those parties are being held in your honor in Pretoria? He said, I came here because I wanted my athletes to know that I was released from prison sooner than I would have been, and I became president sooner than I would have been because of the sacrifices our athletes made during the sports boycott of South Africa. The biggest power of sports story I've ever heard, but there's lots of great power of sports stories. So many years ago, when I first started out doing what I've been doing all these years, somebody who was doing a training session that I was in around 1970 asked everybody in the session as an icebreaker to write what they would like to see on their tombstone. And most people took it seriously, and this is what I wrote. I've added a few things to it since then, but almost all of this was what I wrote that day. He didn't have to be Jewish to want to fight against anti-Semitism. He didn't have to be a person of color to want to fight against racism. He didn't have to be a woman to want to fight against sexism. He didn't have to be from the LGBTQ community to want to fight against homophobia. He didn't have to be a Muslim to want to fight against Islamophobia. He didn't have to be poor to want to fight against poverty. He didn't have to have a disability to want to fight for people who have disabilities. He didn't have to be an immigrant or a refugee to want to fight against xenophobia. He understood that we are all cut from the same human fabric. And that has been what I have lived by since that time. And if our leaders stand up for justice and don't block its path, and that's how I define a leader, if our children have learned how to hate, then we can teach them how to love again. If they're waging war on one another, we have the ability to give them the tools to make peace. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lapchick. You're so inspiring. Your story is inspiring. Your words are inspiring and enlightening. We now have some time for discussion with Dr. Lapchick. There'll be a question and answer part of this. So if you're watching, again, you can put your comment in the YouTube comments just to the right of this video on YouTube, and we'll ask those questions to Dr. Lapchick. Before we get to any audience questions, though, we're going to bring in Timbers forward Jeremy Ebobisse to have a discussion with Dr. Lapchick. Jeremy Ebobisse just got done helping the Timbers win the MLS is Back tournament, scored 4 goals, was named the MLS is Back best 11 during that time, while simultaneously being a leading voice in our current social justice movement. He's an executive board member of the Black Players for Change, which is a group of MLS players that are looking to make change both in and out of the league. So now Jeremy and Dr. Lapchick will have a discussion, and again afterwards, question and answer sessions. If you have any questions, put them in the comments.
Jeremy, thank you for the leadership you've shown this year.
No, thank you. Thank you for the testimony and the powerful story. You know, I think a lot of people are finding themselves asking, you know, where they fit in this story. You know, they're not Black. They don't know how to insert themselves in the fight, but this has never been a fight that Black people would fight on their own, whether you're talking about the 60s or prior to that in abolition around the Civil War. This has always been about coalitions. And thankfully, I find myself in a world of sport where I get to reach different audiences, as you've alluded to, and use that power to promote these difficult conversations. Anyone from the Timbers organization knows that I've been a part of these conversations since I've come in on an individual basis, and now it's been great to, although in the wake of a terrible tragedy, to see an awakening amongst the people in this country. And hopefully I allude to Reconstruction, and I hope that this can usher in that kind of phase for several years, where we can put together some structural changes that will influence the life of Black youth in this country. So thanks for what you shared, and I hope that everyone took as much from it as I did.
Thank you. Tell me what the coalition, its top goals are.
Yeah.
Players.
Yeah, Black Players for Change came together like so many other things during or in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We were angry. We had felt like this was just another moment that we would be going through individually. And so at that point, Justin Moore from Toronto reached out to several of us almost to vent, and a 7-person group chat turned into 100 people. And lo and behold, we used the first game to show a demonstration on the field, really announcing ourselves to the world. But our main goals are going to be moving forward, addressing the MLS ecosystem, making sure that we are being responsive to the Black community, the Black players within the league, and elevating the Black culture, but also talking about the lack of diversity within our coaching staffs, our technical staff, our front offices, and business side of things. So that's going to be really important. We've already started to address the academy side so that Black youth feel like there's a pathway into the sport for them. So that's going to be something that I'm really happy for, because I'm looking at the next generation and feeling as if we need to give them an opportunity. We need to market the game to them, let them know that it's not just basketball, football, or rap, which is kind of the environment that I think a lot of Black youth feel like they're boxed into. And then, we're really just here to defend each other and to promote these messages and educate people as we go. We've all had these experiences on our own, but now to have this unified platform, we feel like we have the ability to share this message on our social media channels, but also to inspire change through different initiatives, which we're going to be unveiling soon. But gearing towards the election season, we've already started some internal messaging that we're going to be pushing public facing. But it's exciting. We're young, we're a motivated group, and we're looking forward to collaborating with all the fan bases and everyone that's out there, because it's going to take a monumental effort.
And you will be a powerful source. I can assure you that. I thought the opening ceremony as the season started in Orlando was very powerful. The imagery.
Yeah, I mean, we worked with so many people to get that done, and we were able to hear from Dr. Harry Edwards, who you'll probably be familiar with, given just everything that you've done in sport and the crossover. But he really inspired us as a group to understand what we were doing it for. And knowing that this would be a picture that would be seen around the world. But now it's about moving past the symbolism as we continue to introduce new symbols, but making sure that we're doing the work in the community. And I know that you've worked with a bunch of athletes along this way. So if you have any advice to us as to how we can best tailor our message and understand that there will be backlash, but how we can not allow the noise to distract from where we're going. I mean, that's something that we're always looking and open to knowing.
Well, I think that Nielsen poll but study that I mentioned was really important to understand that the general public overwhelmingly supports what you're doing. And that just wouldn't have been the case a few years ago. I think that this is a real sign of change, and you're going to be heard when you speak, because of the platform that you have. So and it sounds like you're focusing on a specific range of issues rather than trying to be all over the place, which I think is also really important to focus on some accomplishable goals that you can meet in the short term as well as long term. And yes, I've worked with Harry Edwards for about 50 years. So he's a great leader.
Seems like Jeremy may be having some internet issues, but want to thank him for his time, for his words, for his thoughts, and for him being such an inspiring figure in our Portland soccer community and in this current social justice movement. Dr. Lapchick, now we've got time for some Q&A. And the first question comes in via the comments from Rocky, who asks, that during your talk, he asked this: how do we inspire instead of enrage?
How do we get the effect of inspiring people instead of, I think the more we listen, as opposed to, you've got to confront issues. And I think that's what we're doing. We're actually putting them on the table and discussing them. But there would be times when particularly white people would react either with feelings of guilt or just anger that That's something that happened in the past as opposed to something that's happening every single day. I think that we've got to put things on the table, and I happen to be relatively soft-spoken. I don't think you have to be soft-spoken, but I think the ability to listen is going to make you much more effective. And if people see you're listening, even if you're presenting to them something that might initially spark a little anger or resentment, but then they see you listening to them, I think they're going to be much more responsive.
We have, again, if people have more questions, feel free to chime in. I have a question from listening to you and listening to your speech, and specifically when you were talking about technology and how that has changed the way everybody gets news and experiences oftentimes horrific things that are happening in the world because we can see them. I think technology also can go the other way, right, in that it can spread hate quicker. How do we combat that part of technology?
Well, I think we have to stand up to hate. We can't just let it lay there and fester. We've got to confront it, and it's going on in a lot of places, not only in the technological world, but you can see, signs being painted on college campuses and places that you would hope it wouldn't happen, but it does. And anytime you see it, to do something, say something. As John Lewis inspired so many people to get up and get off. I say everybody can't be on the front lines, but everybody's got to get off the sidelines doing something.
We're waiting for Jeremy to come back in. He should be in a moment. I see some other comments here. This one from Brian, who asks, as someone who works in sport and who believes in social change, how would you respond to those that say his previous comment, which is the refrain of, why don't you just stick to sports? So if somebody tells him or you or an athlete or anybody just to stick to sports, how do you combat that idea?
Well, first, don't. That would be how I would combat it. And again, you can take like the television correspondent who told LeBron to shut up and dribble. Did more to elevate what he was saying than, because it's so preposterous. And you can see the athletes who are speaking out, are incredibly intelligent. They've thought these things out. They're not just out there saying random things. Obviously Jeremy's very impressive and represents, a generation of young athletes who are going to do great things in their communities, not only in the sports world, but in the world way beyond sports is where I think they're going to have the greatest impact.
One moment of the video that we showed that stood out to me was a sound clip of you in 1992. And I think you said basically, I've been doing this for 28 years. That was 28 years ago, right? So now you've been doing it for 56 years, I suppose. What has changed even in that time? Are we closer to where you wanted to be? We're 1992, Dr. Richard Lapchick wanted to be. Are we closer in 2020? Are we further from that?
I think we're, obviously there have been some things that have happened that are signs of progress. We had a black president for 8 years. Yeah. We have a black woman who's hopefully going to be vice president in a couple of months. The income levels of large segments of the black community have increased. But you heard the things I said about the wealth gap and some of the other disparities that are miring too large a section of the population, not only of black people, but all people of color, indigenous people. I'm glad that the Washington football story came up because it really did make us focus on what happened in this country at its start, and the stories about COVID on Native American reservations is so tragic. It's tragic everywhere, but it's particularly tragic there. So I'm doing what I'm doing because essentially I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't have done it for all those years. But we have not even come close to accomplishing what needs to be accomplished is the ultimate answer. There's so much more left to do, but that doesn't mean we haven't done some things along the way that have made it better.
We'll bring Jeremy back in now. and hopefully continue this conversation between you and Jeremy. Jeremy, while you were away, there was a question about athletes being asked to stick to sports. I'm sure you've heard that before. How do you respond when you hear that?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. It's one that unfortunately isn't new. But when someone asks that question, ask into history and understand that Black athletes would have loved to stick to sports and to do the sport that they grew up knowing and loving. But unfortunately, everyone was prejudiced into the sport. I'm sure Jackie Robinson would have loved to just play and to not have to carry the weight of future Black people like me, knowing that he had to represent us better than anyone else, that he can react to racial slur after slur. The history of sports and activism have always been intertwined, and that's something that when people use one of those ill thought out lines, it just goes to the fact that they don't want to ever have this conversation. It's a similar one to you can't protest now because it's the wrong time. And I asked them, when is the right time? Because if it's not at a sporting event, it's not somewhere that's going to catch your attention, then what message is being promoted and at which time is that going to be appropriate for you? The whole point of protest is that it's not supposed to be comfortable. Protest wasn't popular in the 60s. Protest shouldn't be popular. Then ultimately, are we having the difficult conversation that we're saying we want to have? And so I think it's important to contextualize that guys that we revere like MLK, Malcolm X, whoever it might be, they were hated at that time. Their groups were infiltrated by law enforcement, and they were threatened on a regular basis, and they weren't protected. So we're talking about an outdated line that has no real context in history, and I would encourage people to look honestly and not be ashamed of the past, but be motivated to fix it for the future.
And literally assassinated. I mean, literally killed for what they believed and what they were saying at the time. We have another question from Rocky, kind of a follow-up to what he mentioned earlier, and it goes along those lines of like when you're trying to get through to people that maybe say stick to sports or who are hateful, who are saying it's the wrong time to protest or the wrong way to protest. How can you stop from getting frustrated when maybe those people don't want to be educated? And I guess to go further from that, how do you get through to those people?
Yeah, for me, I think it's about your relationship to that person. And is it someone that you're willing to put a lot of time and effort into guiding them on their own self-emancipation, we'll say, because people don't like to be told what to think. But if they actually come to this point of view on their own, then they're much more likely to be a strong believer and in turn want to inspire someone else. So I would evaluate first the relationship, and if there's one where you have the time to guide them along the process, then just be patient with yourself. Understand that it's not your fault that you're not converting someone per se right away. Understand it's going to take time. My friends who I've had multiple conversations with and have come a long way, I had to be patient with them because I knew that they had the capacity to grow, to be more inclusive. When it comes to random people, I think you have to discern who is genuinely trying to improve themselves and have a broader perspective and who is trying to just derail you, get in your head. And so early on in my career, I had a little bit of trouble with that. So I would engage with trolls who had no real inclination to understand my point of view. They just wanted to distract and get me off message. So understanding who your audience is and what you're trying to get out of every conversation, and then also just being gentle on yourself, knowing that you are doing the right thing by engaging in the challenging discussion with someone who might not be as open-minded as you, and just keep believing in what you're doing. Don't get discouraged because we have no choice here. We have to keep going.
Dr. Lapchick, do you have strategies that you've used over 5+ decades of getting through to people that are difficult to get through to?
Well, I think Jeremy's exactly right that there are going to be people who you're not going to get through to. And if you can sort that out and just work on the people who you think you have a chance to have an impact on, that's a start. But my own strategy is to put irrefutable facts out there that you can't argue with. How do you argue with 42 million people having less aggregate wealth than 100 people, or some of the other things statistics I mentioned in there? And I tell the personal story, as people refer to it, because I think it gets people to listen a little closer, and I'm able to work in more of that factual information, and people will listen to it. But I think also, being a storyteller of sorts is important. Jeremy's talking about different parts of his life and how he's evolved. I think people are going to listen to that as well as to the points he's trying to get across.
Yeah, I would echo off that. People do respond to emotions. And when I open up the most vulnerable parts of myself and things that I've buried about, racial animosity on the field, because people talk about soccer as the unifier, and sport can be a unifier, but unfortunately, some people still bring their pre-existing ideology onto the field and use it against me, and have so in the past. But when I share those stories, people are moved, and it does take a toll on me emotionally to share them. But I just wanted to echo that sometimes the appealing to the pathos and the emotions of people is an effective way, because sometimes people don't like to be lectured. People don't like to hear fact after fact, and that's where my mind resorts to too, because I'm reading books, I'm trying to take in different perspectives, but sometimes they throw out their facts that might not be as well researched, but you don't necessarily always have time to dissect them or to understand where they're coming from. So I think finding that combination, like you mentioned, is huge, and not wasting your time on people who genuinely don't have the willingness to grow.
Dr. Lapchick, Jeremy, we want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to participate in this discussion. Dr. Lapchick, for sharing with us your life story and your life work. You guys is so inspirational and enlightening as well. And we hope everybody who watched enjoyed this. This was a wonderful way to kick off the 9th annual Stand Together Week. It's going to look different this year, but hopefully will still be as impactful as in years past. Again, big thanks to Dr. Lapchick and to Jeremy Ebobisse for taking time today and for everything they do in the world to help the world become a better place. Thank you all for watching. Have a great night.